Oh, emotions. The whole sequence, was it needed? Not really. So the question is it any good? Sanderson's Secret Project Day. It is Sanderson's Secret Project Day, but not only that, it is the last secret project of the 4 that he is releasing in 2023. So the question is it any good? As I've done with the others, this will be a spoiler-free video. However, I'm going to talk about the title and the premise and a little bit about it, but it's still going to be spoiler-free. So if you haven't read it, that's fine. But if you want to go in completely blind, not even knowing the name, you might want to come back to this video. The 4th and final secret project is called the Sunlit Man. He must not be Scottish. In cover-wise, this is probably my second favourite. I love this. Yumi's still the nicer cover in my opinion, but I love this style. It feels very noir, especially with the font type, so I'll be interested to see if that actually ties into the story in any way. But a very basic premise is this follows a man called Nomad. Now, if you've read the Stormlight Archive, you will know who Nomad is after the first handful of chapters, but I'm not going to tell you who because it's quite fun to piece together. But we follow Nomad, a man who wakes up on a planet being chased by a group called the Night Brigade. Now, Sanderson has talked in the past about the Night Brigade. We don't really know much about them. However, they are hunting down Nomad. And after waking up on this planet, he finds out that the sun melts away everything under its glare. So the society on this planet kind of lives on this threshold between this raging tempest storm and this glaring sun that would burn and kill everybody as that moves around the planet. So they're constantly moving in this world. It's classic Sanderson, really interesting world building, bizarre, completely out there world building, but super fun. But Nomad is stranded on this planet and he has to find a power source to boost up his investiture, which again ties into the bigger Cosmere. Basically just like an inner magic of how the world works, and he needs that power source to get off planet. Now, what's super exciting about these secret projects, specifically this one, is the Cosmere tie-ins. This is the space age of the Cosmere, which is a lot further in the future than we are with most of the books that Sanderson has released so far in his connected universe. However, I don't think you need to have read any other Cosmere books. Sanderson did say you can pick these up when getting into his work, so please don't be put off by the Cosmere connections. It just will be added context and interest for people who are up to date with specifically the Stormlight Archive with this book. I'm currently about a quarter of the way through, and one thing that I really like that Sanderson has done with this book is the way he has dealt with very powerful characters, because Nomad is in the space age and he's dropped on this fairly primitive planet, which immediately makes you think he's going to be overpowered, he's going to be able to kill everybody, nothing's really going to be an issue to him. And that is a problem or a potential issue with these more overpowered characters in the space age era of the Cosmere. And one thing that Sanderson did really well that you're seeing in this book is how he can temper that level of power and make it an interesting dynamic in the narrative. In this, it is all tied to the amount of power he has, how much investiture that Nomad has. It almost feels like a type of game mechanic or progression fantasy type element. It's not progression fantasy, but it does have that kind of feel to it because X amount of power to leave the planet. He needs X amount of power to be able to start understanding the locals and translating the local dialect. And I assume throughout the story we will start upgrading and getting closer and closer to this maximum power that he needs to get off the planet in the end. And it's just a really clever and fun way to add a level of progression to the story. There is also a side character, I'm going to word it. You'll probably figure out if you're in the Cosmere quite quickly what type of side character this is. Nomad has a spirit-like being that's with him that speaks in his head called Aux or Auxiliary. And I love the banter between them. That's really fun, and also it's really good for learning more about Nomad's past and kind of how he got to this point. But one thing that isn't mentioned enough that I think we will see more and more of, that I'm really enjoying in this book particularly, is how he's blending these magic systems seamlessly together. You would think, oh, how is the this magic system going to be anything like this magic system, but he finds a way for this overarching cosmic level universe that has these certain rules and laws to do with this energy source called investiture. And it's really interesting to see how this translates to different planets and magic systems, and how different cultures on different planets then utilize this power, or how they even access this power. Super creative, but also the amount of foresight that you need to be able to piece this all together is insane. I don't know if he sat down and planned this all out one day, because this doesn't feel like something you could just sit down and plan out, but it's really impressive. I'm really enjoying this book so far. So I'm going to read some more. I'll do a check-in at the halfway mark, and I'll talk a little bit more about this book in particular. I've mentioned this before about Sanderson, that he's really good at mixing the character arcs to the world building or the magic system. In this book, it's quite on the nose, but it's really creative. I do like this idea of connecting the two, and in this case, a man who's running from his past, who's running from the Night Brigade, lands on this planet where the whole society is constantly on the run from the sun. It's just a really nice parallel. I will say that the world building is quite dark. A lot of the elements are a lot darker than I would expect from Sanderson. That being said, this sort of dark tone is definitely masked with the classic sort of Sanderson fun and slightly more light-hearted tone to it. It reminds me of when Daniel talks about the darker horror elements in The Wheel of Time is there, but it's just how Robert Jordan phrases things and sort of doesn't linger too long on these darker elements, makes these horror elements that are really messed up and dark seem lighter than they actually are. And I get a bit of that with this story too, because some of the world building is messed up. And this book definitely comes under a sci-fantasy story rather than just fantasy. A lot of it feels very scientific, and it does lean into this idea that magic is just a science that we don't understand. Instead of just being charged up with this magical energy, there is now a number to it. It has a units and a measurement, and Auxiliary can say to Nomad, we have 5% of what we need to leave the planet. And it definitely makes the magic seem more scientific and leans more into the sci-fantasy side. And I like this slowly weaning onto a more sci-fi approach. It's just something a little different from Sanderson that I'm really enjoying. Character Nomad that we follow, I'd be really interested to see what people think that haven't read Stormlight that picked this up. Because while he's a very fleshed out character just in this book, you do get bits of his backstory, and his arc is set up in a way that you don't have to have read Stormlight, but this is the first of the secret projects I really feel like you would benefit a lot for having been up to date with Stormlight. That being said, this character is very different from his representation in Stormlight. And hundreds of years have passed, so it makes sense that he's a completely different person. But to me, that makes him a really interesting character because he has changed so much, and we do get bits of what connects the old character to this Nomad that we know in this story. And that element of knowing what he was and how he is now, and what happened to make him change so much, is part of the enjoyment I'm getting from this book. So that makes me question, people that are going in that haven't read Stormlight will miss out on that element to the story. You don't need it, but I do think that you get a lot from it. And it just adds an extra depth to Nomad as a character. This is quite a fast-paced book. I've definitely not felt it really slow down much. That being said, there are some sequences that are very science-based. We have Nomad sitting down talking about this planet and how it works, and also some technology that he needs to utilize in the narrative, and there is some lengthy passages talking about the science behind that. And while it didn't bother me, I do think that some people will get to those and just kind of be bogged down a wee bit with the pacing, especially when there is a lot of reiterating points to that science to make sure that the reader understands that I don't think necessarily needed to be there. I will also say that structurally it can be quite repetitive, especially something like this when it's like a chase sequence and they're running from the sun. It is very easy to have a more repetitive structure narratively. It just, you come to a wall, we don't know how to get past this, and you get this tense scene of this approaching evil of some kind. There's lots of different people and things chasing them at different parts of the story. and they need to figure a way to overcome this obstacle, and then they move on. And I feel like that's a big complaint that people have with The Hobbit, which I don't agree with. I love The Hobbit. The Hobbit is terrific. But I can understand this because The Hobbit does just come across something that's very self-contained issue, and then they just solve the issue and move on, and it doesn't really play into this bigger arching story as much. Like, they come across trolls, the trolls try and eat them, they escape the trolls. That whole sequence, was it needed? Not really. And that is a common criticism for The Hobbit, even if I don't necessarily agree. I agree with the point, I just enjoy it. It's just good. The Hobbit's great. Read The Hobbit. However, one thing that Sanderson does to kind of mitigate this issue is he does have world building or lore realizations or character realizations that are tied to overcoming the obstacles in the story. And this means that, yeah, this slightly more self-contained part of the story has been overcome, but you also get a bigger piece of the bigger arch of the overarching story. So while there is a little bit of repetitiveness in the structure, because we're getting pieces of the bigger story, it's not really a big deal. For me personally, of course. I'm planning on reading it and finishing the rest of the book today, so I will do one final check-in of my final thoughts on the final book of the Secret Projects of 2023. I'm excited, I'm having fun with this book. It sounded a wee bit negative in that clip, but I'm not negative, I'm really enjoying it. It's just more interesting to talk about these things than me saying, it was great, I'm having a great time. So I have finished The Sunlit Man. That was a classic Sanderson ending, really satisfying, terrific ending. I enjoyed it. Overall, I really enjoyed this book. I didn't enjoy it quite as much as Yumi and the Nightmare Painter, however, it was still an excellent read. The focus of the story was mainly on Nomad as a character, and who he was before and who he's become, and I will say without that added context of the overarching story of the Cosmere, and all these hints and connections to the other books, I do think this wouldn't be quite as interesting a read. So this is the first of the Secret Projects that I would say you kind of need to be fairly up to date with the rest of the Cosmere. I would say you at least need to read the first two Stormlight books. Because while the Cinder King, the antagonist, wasn't necessarily the main antagonist or focus of the story overall, it's a lot to do with the character arcs and overcoming certain things and dealing with some of this world building. I do think that the Cinder King was probably a weaker antagonist than we normally get from Sanderson. He was just bent on world domination. Even Nomad made a joke in the book that, oh, I've heard this before, which did work for the story, but without that added Cosmere context, I do think it becomes a lot simpler a story. Nomad loses some depth because you don't know how deep his past is. Without that added impact, I do think it loses some oomph. Some other gripes that I think people might not enjoy as much is the earlier points I made about the slightly more scientific passages, which at this point is pretty regular in Sanderson's works. I mean, we got this with Tress. It was maybe not quite as science-based, but even just the scene with her sitting, testing how the spores react, it's that type of, okay, we're sitting here and we're just going to learn about the world for a minute. Which I still did enjoy because this is a really interesting world with really fun magic systems. And I think that's part of the fun of these secret projects, is getting to visit these new worlds that we haven't seen before and learn about new magic systems that we didn't know before. And that is something I really loved about this book, was the magic system in the world. But I definitely think that some people might get a little bogged down with the more scientific sections. What really got me was some of the really heartwarming moments that we got with Nomad, especially in the last half. There's so many moments I'm like, oh, emotions. This unraveling of the world building and the plot was really interesting, and how they wove together, which is something that Sanderson always does really well, but you will not be disappointed with this book. And I talked about the darker elements earlier in this video. Those kind of ebbed away and it became more of a classic Sanderson style and vibe. There wasn't quite as much humor as there have been in some of the past secret projects. However, there was definitely a sprinkling of humor as well. I kind of half wish it did stay with that darker tone. It would be really interesting to see something from Sanderson that really leans into this darker world and personal struggles. I think it would have been really interesting if he kept that up. However, it was still really enjoyable. I did swap between the ebook and the audiobook throughout the day, And while all the other have been Michael Kramer and Kate Redding, the audiobook for The Sunlit Man was done by William Demerit, who was the perfect choice for this book. He did such a terrific job of giving this more grumpy, tired old man on the run vibe to Nomad, and this more monotone, almost AI-like voice for Ox. So if you do like audiobooks, I would highly recommend checking out the audiobook. I know some people don't like Michael and Kate's narrating of Sanderson's work. I personally really do like their stuff, but I do think that William was a better fit for this story. But that's it. I'm really sad to think that this is the end of the year of Sanderson for novels. We are getting Defiant in November, which is part of the Skyward series, so we're not done with Sanderson releases. I don't think we'll ever be done with Sanderson releases. The man can write. But this was a really interesting and unique way to release books, this sort of going in blind. I know a lot of people didn't even look at the titles before picking up the book on each quarter of the year. And because it was something a wee bit different, it added this level of hype in this community of, are you reading the Sanderson Project? Are you reading it when it comes out on the 1st? Oh yeah, I'm going to get up early and pick up and download it and start reading it immediately. But I did really enjoy the more community aspects to this release schedule as well. It was a lot of fun, and we got some terrific entries in the Cosmere. You Mean the Nightmare Painter is still my favourite. However, Sunlit Man and Tress might be vying for second place. They're very different stories. It makes me really difficult to pick one over the other. Tress is a lot more lighthearted and more fairy tale, whereas this is more classic Sanderson. Because I just finished Sunlit Man, I'm kind of leaning more towards that because the emotional punches in the ending is just still resonating with me. And while the Frugal Wizard's Handbook didn't have the same attachment or emotional connections for me personally, I still did have a good time reading it. Let me know, have you read The Sunlit Man? Have you read the other 3 secret projects? If you have, which one was your favourite? I'd love to see your rankings in the comments below. If not, do you plan to pick up any of the secret projects now that they're all released and out there? Let me know in the comments below. But thank you very much for watching. Outro. Oh, I wrote a book, Spine Skellyhead. Every time I forget.